So welcome everybody. I'm John Vinsler. I'm the library director here at Poets House. And I'm the curator of the current exhibition from a selection of items included in a show organized and curated by our special guest tonight. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But thank you all for being here. And thank you for your support of Poets House, whether you make monetary contributions or just for your time and attention of being here today. We really appreciate it. Poet, writer, essayist, and visual artist Mary Ruefle is the author of over a dozen books of poems, essays, and short fiction, including most recently the book by Wave Books. It was originally published in 2023, and this year they published a paperback. She also makes unique hand-altered books from ones she sources from thrift shops, used bookstores, and secondhand texts from the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Some of these similar books are for sale downstairs in our book sale, which is open until 9 p.m. tonight. We'll promptly be closing then, so please have a look. Let's see. Having identified her books, Ruefle goes through the pages and deselects words, applying liquid correction fluid, gouache, or other methods of obliteration. What remains is a kind of excavated composition. Ruefle, who is based in Vermont, has been making erasures, which she illustrates with collages, almost daily since 1998, usually working on 2 pages a day. She has completed more than 125 erasures to date, a selection of which are now on view, and for only a few more days. To celebrate this exhibition and mark its closing, I'm delighted to introduce Mark Wunderlich, the person largely responsible after Mary for this exhibition taking place and having a life in various forms. Before its presentation here, Mark first curated with Aaron McKinney at the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum in 2021, a version of the show. Mark Wunderlich is the author of, most recently, God of Nothingness, Grey Wolf Press, 2021. The Earth Avails, Grey Wolf Press, 2014, winner of the Rilke Prize. Voluntary Servitude, also from Grey Wolf, in 2004. And The Anchorage, University of Massachusetts Press, 1999. I was just showing Mark a copy that he sent to our founder, Stanley Kunitz, that's come back to us, which is really special. His poems, interviews, and reviews, translations have appeared in journals such as the Paris Review, the New York Times Magazine, Poetry, Yale Review, Fence, and Tin House. Wunderlich has taught at Stanford and Barnard Colleges, and in the graduate writing programs at Columbia and elsewhere. He lives in the Hudson River Valley. Thank you for making the trip down to be with us here today. And has taught at Bennington since 2004. He became the director of the Bennington Writing Seminars in August of 2017. It's my pleasure to welcome Mark Wunderlich. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you, really, everyone here at Poets House for making this event possible, but also really for everything that you do here. In this beautiful space with these books for our community of writers. And there is a book sale, of course, downstairs, and I hope you avail yourself of that. But I also want to make a pitch here for the support of our literary organizations. These places, these institutions, these events are made possible by all of us. And if you have the means to support them financially, even in small amounts, it makes a difference. Our organizations, our cultural institutions, our institutions of higher learning are in a state of crisis because they are being attacked. And it is these instruments of culture that are really the thing that are being embattled. And I just want to urge you to support those things that you care about with your time, with your attention, with money, if you can, and Poets House is a worthy recipient of that time and attention. It matters that these places exist. So there's my pitch. I didn't have to say that to be invited here, but it is something I feel passionately about. I am so thrilled to be here, and I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces. I have never done a literary event, I think, since about, I don't know, 2003, in which there was not a former student in the audience. And this includes a reading I gave in Montreal, and a reading I gave in Iceland, and a reading I gave in Berlin, right? So Bennington, the small, its tiny school in the corner of Vermont, has a deep reach into the world of poetry. And I am always gratified by that. So anyway, thanks to all of you who are here, who showed up. I'm equally thrilled to be speaking about the work of Mary Ruefle. And I have written something which I'm going to read. I also have a few pieces of Mary's that I will pepper in and may end just by reading a couple of them. This is both kind of critical, but it's also a bit of a memoir of my friendship and relationship with Mary. And so thank you for indulging me on that. This is called, I'm calling this talk, I Am My Own Imaginary Friend, on the work of Mary Ruefle. And I'm going to begin with a piece of Mary's from her most recent book. And this maybe has to do with the book sale downstairs, so keep that in mind. This one is called Nope. I was in a big city and visited its famous independent bookstore. It was huge. I had trouble finding the poetry and had to ask for help. I sat myself down on the floor in front of all the poetry and looked over the titles. There were so many. I found poets I loved, poets who were my friends, poets I had known who were now dead, poets I had met once and never seen again, but always remembered, poets I had never heard of, all manner of poets. But all these books just made me sad in the end. I knew nobody read them. I read them, but when I did, I just started writing poems myself, creating an endless loop that depressed me. Just then, a teenage boy passed by with his mother. They paused in front of the poetry section, and the boy said, "Look, I found the poetry. Dad is always telling me to look for the poetry, to find the poetry. Well, here it is. I found it." He was making a joke at his father's expense, but his mother seemed moved, for she said, "Would you like to buy a book of poetry?" And the boy said, "Nope," and ambled away. A wave of ridiculous but deep happiness spread over me. Suddenly, I was feeling so happy, I got up and left the store without buying a single book. That's Mary Ruefle from the book. 2. Swimmer. About 15 years ago, on a warm September afternoon on the campus of Bennington College, the semester had just begun, and our first visiting poet of the season had arrived. I was walking Marie Howe across a parking lot to the room where she was going to meet with the class. As we were nearing the building, a car pulled up next to us, parked, and the driver got out of the car. A tall woman, with wet auburn hair, strode toward us, waving. Mary Ruefle had come to see her friend Marie. She had just been swimming, as she does on most days, at Lake Perrin, and she came right from the lake to campus. She was wearing flip-flops on muddy, sandy feet and a black bathing suit, and was still wet from her swim. Marie and Mary embraced, warm greetings were exchanged, and after a few minutes, I said, "We need to get Marie to the classrooms because class is about to begin." Mary asked if she could come along, and both Marie and I said, "Of course." I thought she might go get a towel from her car, but no. She walked with us to the classroom and came in, sat down in her damp bathing suit, and settled in to listen to the class's conversation with Marie Howe. Before we began, I introduced Marie and now Mary to the class, all the while thinking, kids, pay attention. These are two worthy role models. This is what it is to be a poet. What matters is your friendship with other poets. And you might find yourself one day walking across a college campus in your bathing suit and sitting down in a classroom, like in a dream of going to school with no shoes or without your pants, or perhaps like a figure in a poem by Mary Ruefle swimming into a classroom. It may have been right when she stepped out of the car, or it may have been sometime during the next hour when I decided Mary Ruefle and I should be friends. 3. At the Robert Frost House Museum. In 2019, the director of the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum, which is part of Bennington College, told me she had begun a conversation with the poet Mary Ruefle about showing some of Mary's treated books and erasures at the museum. Erin McKenney asked if I might like to join her to curate the event, as she wasn't familiar with Mary's work as a poet and felt I might be able to help place her work in some context. I didn't need to think it over, and just said yes. So began what would become a relationship with Ruefle's visual work that would go on now for years. Erin invited me to come along to Mary's house, to look through the finished books of erasures and to come up with a plan for the exhibition. I had taught a facsimile edition of one of Mary's erasures. Many of you know it. It's called A Little White Shadow, and I was completely entranced by it. The small koan-like statements on each page were sometimes aphoristic, sometimes mysterious, bordering on the cryptic. They rose from the page to give the impression of a life underneath the life of the book. Ruefle had somehow revealed the hidden poetic genius of the book which lay beneath the surface, and by erasing the surrounding text, she had awoken what was there all along. Here are some lines, or pages, from that book. The dead borrow so little from the past, as if they were alive. And another. Autumn had no particular talents, but genius. Some of my favorite pages were those in which a larger story was somehow involved, and I had the impression of the work being almost novelistic, though delivered here in fragments. Here's another quote. Other people read sonnets, but my cousin Suvia never cared for blood. And in this, as in most things, I agreed with her. And another. At last, standing breathless before 2 donkeys, I stopped and spoke with them. Those are all from A Little White Shadow. Humorous, absurd, surreal, the erased pages seemed inevitable, self-assured. The voice Ruefle created here, both a borrowing and a fashioning of a voice. As Mary had said, after finishing an erasure, it is as if she had written a book of poetry without having written a single poem. It is like writing with the eye rather than writing with the hand. And that's a quote from Mary. Mary toured us through the small, tidy house, and we went upstairs to the room where she worked. A painting of a scene from a fairy tale hung on the wall. Was it Red Riding Hood, Snow White? I seem to remember dwarves. On her desk was a book in the process of being erased, along with typed, and this is with a typewriter, of course, lists of upcoming engagements, letters to write and letters received, etc. An ashtray and the homey smell of cigarette smoke filled the room, and I imagined Mary sitting at the desk, cigarette in one hand and the little brush from the correction fluid bottle in the other, smoking and erasing, smoking, erasing, one cloud from the lungs to the atmosphere, another cloud from the bottle of correction fluid to the page. Back downstairs, the erased books were in a stand in the living room, and Mary encouraged us to just take them down and page through them. The books are similar in size and shape and age, hardbound, cloth covers, generally short. How do you select the books to erase? I asked, and she said, I look for 19th and early 20th century didactic children's books that refer to God. That's the ideal book to erase. Erasing literature I admire is not desirable. Why would I want to do that? Speaking of the art of erasure, I used to see the act of covering up someone else's work in order to make your own as a kind of aggression. To erase is to make something disappear. But this idea also relies on the fallacy of originality. The work of literature is somehow completely inviolable and unique. Mary's work in this realm leads us to think of a work of literature containing other works of literature inside them. The erasure is a form, not a policy. Within a single page of any text, one might find, write with the eye, not with the hand, another text poetic in tone. I find, too, that these books of erasures contrast irony and sincerity, and that these two tonal registers are dressed in one garment, which is poetry. 4. My private property. One of my favorite pieces of writing by Mary Ruefle is My Private Property. Note how I avoid naming the genre. The text sits somewhere between an extended prose poem and an essay, perhaps a short fiction, for we don't know if it is true to some personal experience or not. The piece moves like an essay, ambling from subject to subject, shocking us a little, dropping clues about some antecedent scenario which has driven the protagonist to skip school and go to a museum in Brussels to view a shrunken head. I resist calling My Private Property a lyric essay, as that category label is as diminishing and unserious as creative writing, and therefore I wish to expel it from common usage beginning here tonight. The subject of this essay, My Private Property, is the writer's 16-year-old self and her fascination with a shrunken human head, which leads Ruefle to tell us about the ways in which shrunken heads are made. We also learn that the speaker's mother has been in a horrific accident, which has caused her head to swell grotesquely, cruelly, rendering her unrecognizable. The other subject, of course, is the crime of the colonial enterprise. And the mature Ruefle reflects on how everything in this anthropological museum is stolen, and that a larger, almost unfathomable crime has led to this moment in time when a 16-year-old girl skips school to stand in front of a case and gaze at a human head. If you have not read this essay or lyric essay or extended prose poem, however you wish to label it, you should read it, for it is an example of good writing and good thinking, but it is not easy or reassuring, as it rejects moral certitude in order to explore what it means to own something. In this case, a severed and altered human head. It is an essay that makes us, or me anyway, uncomfortable. And that discomfort I experience as a reader stems from our complicity in the greater scheme of the colonial enterprise, reduced here to a story about a teenage girl's encounter with that shrunken head, and our own delight in reading about it. What is property? What is privacy? What can we own? And what should we never own? Ruefle returns to a fantasy of having the heads of her beloveds shrunken and placed in an egg carton which she could then possess. Aren't ancestors the people who loved the people we love, then going backwards in time? Do we possess them? Ruefle asks the question, but doesn't strive to solve or resolve, doesn't soothe us artificially with an episode of moral arousal followed by preening moral certitude. She lets the reader reside with her in confusion and tension, the comfort being our knowledge that we reside there together. 5. All flesh is grass. I invited Mary Ruefle to serve as the commencement speaker for the MFA program I direct. On the day of graduation, she brought a prop with her, a flat rectangular wooden box in which was a kind of rectangular dried pulpy mush. It looked like it was pulped paper, like the material used to make paper. Of course, it was paper, as the object was a book that Mary had kept in her backyard for almost 2 years, exposed to the elements. She was then able to watch the book decompose over time. Why do such a thing? Well, Ruefle tells us this is the fate of all literature, after all. Eventually, every book will break down into mush, into ash, into compost and carbon and air. Mary's decomposing book is a kind of memento mori, a reminder of our own vanity, and that the, quote, momentary stay against confusion, as you will remember, that a poem is not deathless, but momentary, fleeting, finite. Quel drag for a commencement speech, no? But no. She goes on to tell us what we must know. She writes, quote, I am not ashamed to take what joy I can in writing. It is neither a little joy nor a small solace. It is enormous. My advice to you is to sit down, look out the window, and go to work. Through a small hole in a high fence, you are offering a gift to a stranger. 6. The post office as miracle. Mary served as the poet laureate for the state of Vermont for several years, an appointment she accepted the year before the pandemic. She went on to receive a fellowship from the Academy of American Poets to fund a public project. This was the spring of 2020, just as the COVID pandemic was settling in and scotching everyone's ambitious plans for poetry readings and festivals and workshops in schools and libraries and parks. Of all the poets laureate awarded grants that year, only Mary's plans went unchanged. Mary's project was simple. She planned to use the phone books at the public library in Bennington, Vermont, to get the addresses of 1,000 Vermonters. She then copied 1,000 poems she admired, not by herself. There were some repeats, but mostly they were all original. She then put a poem in an envelope, addressed it to one of her 1,000 Vermonters, and mailed them a poem. The authors' names were on the poems, but she included no other information, and she did not supply a return address. The poems were handed along from post office to letter carrier to mailbox and delivered. And if they weren't delivered, no one had any way of knowing. She had no way of finding out. She hadn't given a return address. Mary assumed most of these wound up in the bottom of the car or in the trash, but she suspected some didn't. Someone, somewhere in Winooski or Tinmouth or Dummerston, walked down their gravel road to the mailbox and found an envelope with a handwritten address, inside which was some mysterious document, i.e., a poem. Maybe it wound up on the refrigerator, or maybe it was used to light the wood stove. No one had any way of knowing. I am enormously proud to report that Mary chose one of my poems to send to a random Vermonter, and so I got to imagine someone in Eden or Blissville or maybe Avery's Gore, way up in the Northeast Kingdom, got a strange poem from me about the time I visited a town in northern Germany where Rilke had once lived and where I found myself one lonely spring a decade ago. Mary Ruefle famously does not use email. When she first encountered email, she thought, like the boy in the poetry section of the bookstore, nope, not for her. And now, doesn't she look like the one who made the right call? As we know, email only begets more email, and she decided she would not feed the beast. As a result, when I have business to conduct with Mary, I do what we all used to do back in another century, which is pick up the phone and dial her number. And she usually answers, and then we talk on the phone. That, or I write her letters or postcards. 7. Postcards. I, like Mary, love postcards. I love their semi-public nature, exposed as they are on one side to any curious reader, the postal carrier, in whose hands they might fall. On the other side is an image a photo of an attraction or a work of art or a curiosity. Space is limited, and so one has to be brief, clear, and immediately interesting. How like a poem a postcard is, a recipient, an image, the separation of time and space. I and thou wish you were here. And the possibility of someone also listening in, reading the message that was not intended for them, but having it shared with them nonetheless. I have a box of all the postcards I have received from Mary, as, like her treated books, she alters postcards as well. Here, her principle of composition is easy. A piece of found text is applied to the image on the postcard, usually with a piece of Scotch tape. Of all of Mary's work, I find her altered postcards the funniest. The juxtaposition of image and found text in her postcard collages tends to the absurd. The images on the cards are as varied as the form itself and fall into the category of the received and chosen as opposed to the composed, again, writing with the eye rather than with the hand. Word and image, think of a caption, an illustration, a diagram, a subtitle, a billboard, graffiti. Ruefle applies language to the surfaces of an image, and we suddenly have an authorial voice, and often a kind of shadowy narrative that erases the anonymity of a commercially produced postcard and gives it a comic point of view. In the early 20th century, the postcard as literary form was embraced by the young Vienna Café Society writer Peter Altenburg, who loved the limitation of space the postcard provided. In his cape and sandals, walrus mustache, and broad-brimmed hat, he sat in the Café Central, writing on postcards which he mailed to newspapers and to friends. The composer Alban Berg composed 5 orchestral songs after postcards by Peter Altenburg, and when performed, under the direction of Schoenberg, the audience responded by rioting. I want to say something about Mary's postcards being a riot, but I won't. They are more subtle than Berg's composition, more ironical, and yes, she does send them through the mail. As I mentioned, I have a box of them with the captions that Mary has sent me over the years, and they are a treasure. In the bathroom of the taproom bar of Left Bank Ciders in Catskill, New York, there is a printed text in a small frame. As you dry your hands, you can read the text, which is a poem by Mary Ruefle, appropriate to the establishment that ferments ciders from apples harvested in the Catskills and the Hudson Valley. The poem is called Apple in Water, and I'll read it here. I was swimming with the taste of apple in my mouth, a shred of apple skin between my teeth. I guess it doesn't get any better than this, said the water. These are troubled times, said the shred. And the apple wasn't really there, only a lingering taste of it. As if it were the last apple or an earlier one that had lasted. Either way, it was silent, and I swam with the silence in my mouth, listening to the pretty crimson dot and the great slipping glimpser, not knowing whether I heard a night of love or a love of night. Such was the knowledge gained during that long, languid swim. This poem, which is from Ruefle's 2019 collection, Dunce, uses the logic of dreams, but also the symbolic register of dreams. As the Jungians tell us, water, when it appears in dreams, is indicative of the subconscious, the great flow of knowledge that is unavailable to us but for glimpses. Mary, an ardent swimmer, has placed this speaker in the water, where the speaker, element, and object are all alive, all capable of speech. The water speaks, and so does the apple. And what is revealed is the pure knowledge of not knowing. A night of love, or a love of night, which is it? The speaker never finds out, but names this as the knowledge that is indeed gained. In Ruefle's essay On Secrets, from her collection of essays and talks about writing and poetry called Madness, Rack, and Honey, by the way, if you have not read this book, I envy you. You can read it for the first time. It's marvelous. She writes, quote, "Very often, as a teacher and reader, I encounter poems that do not take my feelings into account, and this is unacceptable to me. Every time I read a poem, I am willing to die insofar as I am surrendering myself to the mercy of someone else's speech, and I do not want to die in the presence of someone else's vile corruption of feeling. You are supposed to be preparing me for my death. Do not misunderstand me. Rage, sadness, uncertainty, discomfort, awkwardness, resignation, and lament are subjects of a great many poems I am very willing to hear, as are poems of joy, surprise, delight, and tenderness, as are poems that renounce emotion in favor of a detached observation of the outer world, or indulge only in an exploration of language itself. All of the poems of the wandering spirit in search of an unknown finality, in search of a secret." Back to Erasure. The Robert Frost Stone House in Shaftesbury, Vermont, is an 18th century Dutch colonial house which was the home of Robert Frost and his family from 1920 to 1929. It's a charming house and sits on 80 acres on which Frost imagined he would grow apples. Frost wasn't a very good farmer, I think it's important to know, and 9 years is hardly enough time to establish an orchard, but he did win the Pulitzer Prize while he was living in this house, and he also wrote a poem there that we all know, which is "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." And I'm going to read that poem for you because why not read it? "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping there to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." The Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum has the problem of many writers' house museums, which is that visitors have to stand around reading things posted on the walls of the house, and this is boring. So when the director of the museum decided to show Mary's work in the house, I was thrilled. The house was being used not as a kind of shrine to the past, but as a place where the work of a living poet and artist could be experienced. The exhibition of Mary's erasures and collage postcards was to be installed in a single room, in vitrines, and in frames on the wall. Everything fit perfectly in this domestic space, but one whole wall had "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening" stenciled large on it. This had been done many years earlier, and after discussing it, Aaron, the director, and I decided it was time to paint over the stenciled poem. Now, the exhibition at the museum was delayed by almost a year due to the pandemic, and we kept pushing back the opening. Finally, we got to a place where the museum had reopened, and Mary came to have a look at the exhibition space. We showed her the vitrines, the available wall space, and a corner shelf where other objects could be shown. Aaron mentioned that we had decided to paint over the stenciled poem on the wall, and Mary paused and said, "Or I could erase it." I will pause here to note that Mary loves Robert Frost, or the poems of Robert Frost. You may recall that earlier in this talk I quoted her as saying that she was not interested in erasing literature she admired. In this case, she made an exception. Mary took a copy of the poem, and from "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening," she created the following poem. Stopping. I think I know, now, a frozen year. The only sounds, the weep of promises and sleep. An erasure for the pandemic. I think I know now a frozen year. How apt to reduce what we thought we once knew, the jaunty lines of iambic tetrameter ordered into quatrains, now fragmentary, quiet, remote. Gone is the little thinking horse, the farmhouse, and even the woods and the frozen lake, erased. What is left is the poem that slept inside the poem, thawed out a bit by the writing eye of Mary Ruefle. So, I'm going to conclude by reading just a couple pieces by Mary, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. These are all short prose and from her most recent book, and since she isn't here, I thought it would be nice to end with her voice. This one is, I'll read this one. It's from my private property. It's called Little Golf Pencil. At headquarters, they asked me for something dry and understated. Mary, they said, it's called a statement. They took me out back to a courtyard where they always ate lunch and showed me a little tree that was, sadly, dying. Something with 4 legs had eaten it rather badly. Don't over-emote, they said. I promised I wouldn't, but I was thinking to myself that the something with 4 legs had certainly over-emoted, and that the tree, in response, was over-emoting now, being in the strange little position of dying. All the cops were sitting around eating sandwich halves and offered me one. This one's delicious, said a lieutenant. My wife made it. Seeing as it was peanut butter and jelly, I thought he was over-emoting. But I didn't say anything. I just sat looking at the tree and eating my sandwich half. When I was ready, I asked for a pencil, and they gave me one of those little golf pencils. I didn't say anything about that either. I just wrote my statement and handed it over. It was a description of the tree, which they intended to give to their captain as a Christmas present. The captain, well, he loved that tree, and he loved my writing, and every one of the cops hoped to be promoted in the captain's heart, and who knows, maybe get a raise. Still, all that sitting around in the courtyard eating sandwich halves, I had a nice feeling of sharing. So when they asked me whether I had anything else to say, I told them that in the beginning you understand the world, but not yourself. And when you finally understand yourself, you no longer understand the world. They seemed satisfied with that. Cops, they're all so young. And just one more. Love story. This is from the book, her most recent book. The one winter I spent by the water, I would walk out on the ice every evening at dusk after the ice fishermen had abandoned their shanty. I would peer into the window of stapled plastic and watch the stick of frozen butter as it lay there on a plywood counter. I don't know what the butter was for. I knew they built fires on the ice for warmth and drank out of bottles for warmth, but butter in the shanty? I never saw them actually cook. They would take the fish home. Home not being the shanty being a temporary winter dwelling where they could store their gear and stuff. The sun would set, throwing a glare on the ice, and sometimes I saw through the window that it cast a glare on that stick of butter. I went back every day to check on the butter. It was never unwrapped. It was never cut. And then spring came. Overnight the shanty sank on a doily of slush, and the butter went with it. I never asked. I never found out, but as the days grew warmer, warm enough to melt butter over an afternoon, I often thought to myself that it was the perfect love story, and I was glad the butter had disappeared overnight and not stuck around to melt. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for Mark?
I'm terribly shy. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I've been reading Mary, writing my own erasures, and several questions have come up, and I want to ask two. One is, what do I need to know about poetry to find a new poem in an erasure? And the other question is, and you may not be able to answer this one, but what can I learn about poetry by erasing poetry? Or erasing a text?
Yeah, I will just refer to the things that Mary has said about this. I think that might be the most useful. And one is that, I asked her, how long do you take doing this? She's like, oh, not long. She's like, I don't labor over this. She's like, it takes, she works on like a spread a day, like a 2-page spread in a book. That's what she likes to do, right? And she said, this is the first thing I like to do in the morning. And so she's up there, and truly, she's like up there in that room. She's like smoking and erasing. Like that's what she's doing. She's using this correction fluid. That's her favorite thing to use. She uses other materials, but it's mostly what it is. And she said, I just choose it very quickly. She's like, I'm not, if it's not obvious, I turn the page and move on to something else. She also really describes the pages that she uses for erasure as a form. It's not that, she's not really thinking that much, I don't think, she has said, that about the thing that she's getting rid of. She's selecting, she likes sentences, right? If you read through the erasures out there, she's really forming sentences. So that's one way, I think, to start this process. Make a sentence. Look for a noun, a verb, and an object, right? And a direct object. That's a great way to start. And she's often, going for these strange juxtapositions of things, and they're funny. That's what is also happening. But the thing about erasure, of course, is that the words to choose from are limited. It's what's on the page, right? And so you have to go through, and she circles them with a pencil, and, she then starts erasing things, and sometimes she changes it afterwards. And what do you have to know about poetry to do this? I don't know. I think what you're looking for is, you're looking to, first of all, get outside of your own head, right? That's what part of this is too, is that it's not you and your precious thoughts, all day, which we walk around with all the time, and which is often the thing that stops us from composing. It's like, oh, how do I start? Well, the choices are made for you. This technique is, the limitation of choices. We think of this really coming from Oulipo and the Dada artists of the time, using and really collage found materials. That's the other part of this too, is that the materials she's using are found, right? She's selecting them because of what she thinks, they might contain, say, and contain, and then she's extracting the kind of poetic fragment from them by, erasing what is around it. She has a real affection for the books she erases as well. She often talks about what they are, and but she, as she said, I have that quote that I have that I read. When I finish one, I have the feeling that I have written a book of poetry without having written a single poem. And that is kind of one way of thinking about it. She isn't composing what we think of as a poem, right? I don't know if that helps.
That was such a good answer. Does anyone have that? Let's go.
Is she at all interested in surrealist art? Because this seems to work with that.
Yeah. Mary is interested in many, many, many things, right? Like she's got this little fainting couch, this Victorian fainting couch in her living room in front of her fireplace. and with a really nice reading lamp, and she reclines there and reads, right? There's like a stack of books. She was reading Knausgaard when I was last there. So, yeah, she does. She loves, she talks about visual art quite a bit, about the surrealists, about poets she loves and admires. But I like to compare what she's doing with, artists like Annie Albers, or the kind of Dada artists of the early 20th century, and she really is, I think, in conversation with collage and with collage artists. So many poets have gravitated toward collage because of the found nature of it. And, I also, of course, think of Cornell's boxes, those things beloved by every poet, right? Because they are a box, because they contain things, because, it is a kind of frame and form that surrounds them. And they're hard to resist. They're so incredible to look at, so beautiful and strange. And I think of her work in that, in that context often too, that, she is also, like Cornell, canvassing the Goodwill and the used bookstores and garage sales for objects. The other thing is, of course, in those books, there are collages, there are images. Sometimes, very rarely, she sort of draws or paints something, but that's not really what she does. They're found images. And she has, in her house, she has these files full of things that, images she has collected. And they're she's incredibly organized and tidy, right? And so there's these, she has files with like images in them, little drawers. There's one that I loved, and it's just called Stains. Right, she has like, here's a drawer full of stains, and there's another one, and it's like ash was another one, like images of that, and so she'll think of something that she wants to kind of compose, a collage that will speak in some way to the text that she's doing, and then sort of add that in.
Another right here. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you so much. This is my first exposure to her work, and I don't know if my question maybe can be answered already by some things you've said. But my first comment is when you were reading some erasures at the beginning, I wondered how your performance was influenced by where the words were appearing on the page and the interaction between the poem apart from the page, yeah, and its whether she sees her erasures as being connected permanently to the page that she's erased, or whether she sees them as having a life apart from that page.
Yeah, I think, I can't really speak for her, but my sense is, she never reads from these, and it was super awkward reading her erasure lines, to be honest. I think they really do exist as part of the object. And that when extracted and, taken out of that context, they I selected a couple that I thought could kind of stand on their own and that had some integrity in that way. But I think it's really all about the experience of looking at them. The other problem, of course, with exhibiting books is that books are meant to be handled and paged through, right? They're not meant to be looked at through glass. Right, that's not why they were made the way they are. I mean, they're such a genius design. They fit in our hands, and we all know what to do with them, And her books indeed are meant to be paged through. One just can't, right? There are 2 facsimile editions available. You can buy them. One is a little more dear. A Little White Shadow is in a paperback, and you can get that, inexpensively. There's another one, a nice hardbound edition of her work, and so you can buy that and have that experience. But she really does, when you go to her house and she's like, "You're there, just have it, flip through them." She's also, was very particular about which pages she wants displayed. Right? She has her favorite. She says, that not every page is great. She's like, I did it, and I think this page turned out really well, and so she's kind of particular about those. In Tucson, the show was also shown at the Poetry Center at University of Arizona, in Tucson, and they paged through them regular, like once a week. They turned the pages, so that you could come back and you could look at the different things, and that gives you a sense of like what they contain. But she's not that fussy about them, actually. She's like, and rather, I think maybe to John especially, with some frustration, she's not always using, like, definitely not using archival materials when she's doing it. She loves tape and, like correction fluid. God only knows what that's made of, and she's got boxes of it, and that's what she loves most. Sometimes it's gouache, and, some of the pages are like the paper is, you can distorted by acid and all those things. She sometimes makes little repairs to them, but the repair is usually like, I'm going to stick a piece of tape on this. That's how she does it. She's not, a lot of visual artists, they love documentation and preservation. They think about that all the time for very worthy reasons. That's not Mary. She's like, whatever. Just page through it, enjoy it. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to extract it from the page. I think the experience is really about looking at it, because you're looking at the whole thing, and there's an image to it as well. One of the cool things about the poem that was on the wall, is that we used, my partner teaches studio art. He helped at Amherst, and he helped install the show. And he was the one who painted over, he was looking at the page that she'd erased and then, painting over it. And we had used paint, and he had diluted it slightly so that it looked like correction fluid. And the effect was actually pretty great, but he was super nervous. He's like, stop filming me while I do this. I don't want to erase the wrong word. He said it was really sort of stressful doing it. But the effect was like a large erased poem up on the wall that you got to see. And it really did. He managed to sort of get the material just right to make it look like correction fluid. There are images of it. We made a postcard of it. Yeah, we made a postcard of it. They're around Bennington. I'll have to dig some up. But you know what I'll do? I'm actually going to publish my remarks on my Substack, and I'll be sure and put images along with it and include that one. Yeah.
As a poet, I'm curious what you've learned or taken from Mary's practice and brought into your own practice.
I've learned I'm so inspired by her and the way she works. And the devotion that she has to the way, as she said, she's like, the best day. Like, if this is how she likes to start her day, for the last couple of years, she's been caretaking her husband, the wonderful poet Michael Burkhardt, who died earlier this year. And she was unable to really work because of that. She was caring for him at home. He had Parkinson's disease. And she, talked about how frustrated she was that she couldn't, she said, I feel so detached from myself doing this. She's like, I'm devoted to him and I will see him through. But there's also a part of herself, a very important part she was giving up. And she's returned to that work, which is great. But, one of the things that I've always made, like secretly made visual work, mostly collage and other things. And she's inspired me to do that, though I've been reluctant to show it in the world. But one of the things is that she's so committed to, her work is like beautifully published and available, and she's had and continues to have this a wonderful career as a writer and a poet. But the things that really matter to her are her relationship, I think, her relationship to the practice of writing in its various forms, and to her friends, to her friendships, and to the kinds of friendships that a life in poetry and literature has led her to. She is this beloved figure among a community of poets in Bennington, Vermont. Students certainly will go swimming with her, and like parents, she really does go swimming like almost every day. And they go swimming with her. You'll see her at the thrift stores. She's like infinitely approachable. You can write her a letter; she'll write you back. It's those kinds of things. It's the ways in which she has ordered her life to build it around writing and literature and this visual practice that she has. It's deeply inspiring. It's a life, I think, of making meaning. And what else is better than that? She's figured that out. So I think all of that is inspiring.
That's a really good place to maybe leave it. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. So we can continue the conversation amongst ourselves. We'll be promptly closing at 9 o'clock, which gives you an hour to shop the book sale if you'd like to. And will you stick around for a moment? Yeah. So thank you all for coming. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.